The period of thaw and de-Stalinization are the components of the Soviet government, the result of a political struggle for power in the second half of the 50s, first half of the 60s. Although these are completely different concepts, in this sense it was an attempt of the Communist Party elite to reform the Soviet system, save the political collapse and economic collapse that threatened the USSR. On the one hand, you can take the Khrushchev thaw as a civil heroism of political leader. On the other, party leadership realized that inevitability of the death of totalitarian state. Objectively viewing the periods of thaw and their Stalinization, it should be highlighted that these events were not random but were caused, firstly, by the high rate of technological development which experienced the whole world after the Second World War. Secondly, the gap in living standards of the Soviet Union's people from the leading countries of the world. Collectivization and industrialization have led to production decline and a significant backlog of village development. Thirdly, mass repression undermined the authority of the government both in foreign and domestic policy. The great Soviet state couldn't exist in isolation from the outside world, so firstly, they ensure the continued further existence and operation of the Soviet system was impossible without the trust of the people, the cultural intelligentsia, educated people. And of course, don't exclude the factor of a power struggle between Khrushchev and Beria. Officially, the process of de-Stalinization began on February 25, 1956, at the 20th Party Congress after the speech of Khrushchev on the cult of personality and its consequences. The text of the speech was announced at a private meeting and was not subjected to the announcement in the press, was published only in 1989. Moreover, in the report, full responsibility for the illegal repression fell on Stalin and Beria. The Communist Party itself remained beyond criticism. The process of thaw is associated with the death of Stalin on March 5, 1953. Since then, in high places of political power began struggle between Khrushchev, Beria, and Malenkov. But whatever the real reasons of Khrushchev, people felt some relief. The repressions were stopped and began the process of rehabilitation of illegally repressed, and although rehabilitation was carried out selectively and didn't concern persons, Crimean Tatars and some cultural figures, but they were the first shoots. It weakened the ideological control of the culture that led to the birth of a generation 60s, children of the 20th Party Congress. Further criticism of the personality cult, 21st, 22nd Congress, excluded recurrence of authoritarianism in this form in the future. Addressing other social issues, housing program, the prohibition of child labor, 5-day working week, the abolition of tuition fees in senior classes, retiring farmers, and other issues inspired the hope of the Soviet people in a really bright future and building of communism in 80s. There were also some changes in the national question, most likely because Khrushchev resisted the authority of the Ukrainian communists. These changes occurred both in the national and in the economic sphere. Creating sawner houses, industrial regional government led to the empowerment of the republics in economic planning and management. 97% of enterprises were transferred to the control of Ukraine, increased production of consumer goods. The leaders of the Republic of the period marked by particular relation to the identity of Ukraine. It is necessary to remember 1953's, 1957's, and Kirichenko. During his authority was Ukrainization of CPU performed the activity of the rehabilitation of the repressed, put the question about the purity of the Ukrainian language and the development of national science. His devotion to Khrushchev was noticed, and after the removal of Malenkov, Kakhanovich, and Molotov, Kirichenko was summoned to Moscow, where he was appointed the secretary of the CPSU. In 1963 to 1972, Shelest is obliged by his career to Khrushchev and Podgorny. During the years of his rule, USSR occupied a leading position in the system of the USSR. Shelest became particularly famous after the release of his book Our Soviet Ukraine, in which he justified and expressed his vision of the economic independence of the republic and its economic potential. This book was one of the reasons for the prosecution of the author in convenience of nationalism. In 1972, he was summoned to Moscow, where he held the position of secretary of the Moscow Committee of the CPSU. The process of de-Stalinization made their adjustments in the National Liberation Movement, and the first dissident organizations appeared. Such organizations of dissidents as the United Party of the Liberation of Ukraine, 1963, Ukrainian Workers' Peasants' Alliance, 1959, Ukrainian National Committee, 1960, Ukrainian National Front, 1960, were created in Ukraine during 1953 to 1960s. Organizations of dissidents carried out activity aimed at criticism of the Soviet system, demanded the termination of Russification policy, promoting the idea of independence, etc. Many historians describing the process of de-Stalinization and the period of the thaw marked half of reform and limited of actions, saving administrative command system, the dominance of communist ideology, the transformation of repressive system, closed Soviet society. But let us remember and give an answer to the questions. Who started the transformation? What should be changed? Could there be more radical reforms? What would be the consequences of more radical reforms? And we see that the deepening of the processes initiated by Khrushchev would lead to the complete destruction of the entire political system and the Soviet state as a whole. But progressively minded communists of that time were not ready for this. This would be possible only in the second half of the 80s. Therefore, if you put questions about the reasons for the collapse of the USSR, the answer will be necessary to look for in the processes of the 50s to 60s. Khrushchev, by his activity, proved the impossibility and the inability to reform the totalitarian authoritarian state of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. As for such states, democracy and liberalism are disasters.